You are listening to No PC Allowed, aka No Political Correctness Allowed, and I am Mac Iverson. Real ID and FISA. If you don't know about these twin demons, that's because the deep state wants you to remain deaf, dumb, and blind as to just how deeply they have crept into your life. I'm going to combine these two topics because they're pretty similar in many ways. First, Real ID. We're all being told lately that we must have it. What is it? Well, Real ID is a real fake. This was decided by a pushover Congress shortly after 9/11. The DHS presented a commission with a two-paragraph suggestion on federalizing state driver's licenses. But the idea is to limit the travel of conscientious citizens who don't want to be tracked, because it automatically targets the ones who will not sign up for the ID for eventual persecution. It is forced conformity for the deer-in-the-headlights average grab-the-ankles schmuck in order to isolate and identify conservatives who won't take on this obvious precursor to the mark of the beast. Think I'm exaggerating? Listen on. For example, if you were to ask this basic question that any 5-year-old would ask, what does the Real ID do that driver's licenses can't do? And then type that highly intelligent but bare-bones logical question into just about any search engine, what answer will you get? If you predict Zippo, then you're spot on. The algorithms for that simple, honest question appear to not even exist. It refuses to even answer your question. That's because no good answer even exists. Do you ever look at the drop-down list of queries that others have typed in before you? And it seems that absolutely no one on planet Earth is even remotely curious enough about the satanic idea of the Orwellian named, air quotes, Real ID to even inquire about it? Why does Real ID even need to exist? Whatever happened to libertarians? Do they even exist anymore? It makes you feel utterly alone in your desire to maintain any semblance of liberty and privacy. And that's the point. By obviously censoring the drop-down box, deep state-controlled big tech is trying to make you feel as though there is something seriously wrong with you for even asking the question of why do we even need a real ID? No one else is asking online, or so they lied to us. Therefore, you must be crazy. The overpowering assumption is, don't even ask that question, or even, how dare you ask that question? We, the deep state, need it because we, the deep state, are demanding it, period, end of story. But that sounds completely crazy. That makes zero sense. And again, that's the point. Just like the COVID scam scare, if the lockdowns made any sense, they wouldn't need to demand lockdowns. The vast majority of people would simply do the common sense deed of avoiding others and voluntarily quarantine themselves. Because most smart people don't want to die. But lockdowns never did make any sense because the deep state never followed any real science. They just lied that they did. And most people who refused the shot knew they lied about following any real science. But legions of morons believed them, or they simply followed the crowd like lemmings running off a cliff to certain death. The shots destroyed lives and the lockdowns destroyed businesses, not COVID. COVID had nothing to do with any of that. It was just the excuse of tyrants to move in and take as much money and power as they possibly could. Always remember this. A quarantine is restricting the movements of sick people. Tyranny is restricting the movements of healthy people. The point, and our lesson, is this. If they can get you to obey nonsense commands, then they can get you to do absolutely anything. They really can. The most obvious question that should be asked, then, is why do we need this new ID? But there is no obvious answer other than control for control's sake. The closest we can get to any answer at all is this silly rationalization from dmv.org. It is to show that the identification card has met the level of security it deems appropriate for access to certain types of federally overseen locations. Unquote. So its main purpose is to segregate certain Americans away from federal locations, namely conservatives. Again, because many of them won't get the ID. And what's the rationalization for needing this now? 9/11 happened decades ago, and they're only now getting it going. And conservatives weren't to blame for 9/11, the deep state was to blame. Federal locations need more protection from their self-created open borders insanity than our own families do? Really? In what universe does that make any sense? At all. Gradually removing our freedoms is the most unsafe thing we can ever do. Safety doesn't even enter into it unless we're talking about making Americans exponentially less safe. On purpose. This from SoCalPublicSquare.org. This American horror story started with 9/11, when hijackers used fraudulently purchased Virginia driver's licenses to to board planes, which they then flew into the World Trade Center and Pentagon, and the field in Pennsylvania. After that, states cracked down on driver's license fraud and beefed up security measures, and the federal government boosted airport security. There haven't been any hijacking since. That should have been the end of it, but the American security state never stops pursuing more control over our lives. So, real IDs, imposing onerous new requirements on state-issued IDs, including driver's licenses, passed Congress in 2005 with little debate, since it funded a bill that funded tsunami relief, unquote. Notice the bleeding heart attachment to that tsunami relief. What do those two things have in common? Absolutely nothing. American soft hearts have gone to their heads. That's how devious liberals are. They will even use the threat of withholding tsunami relief to destroy our freedom. The assumption is if you conservatives vote down emergency relief, then we'll send our Chinese mafia-controlled fake news industrial complex attack dogs on you, portraying you all as heartless and insensitive. And all the simpleton, low IQ, overeducated, useful idiot, undecided voters will swallow whatever bile we feed them so that they'll dutifully and obediently vote against conservatives. All that, by the way, is straight out of the woke playbook on mass manipulation of the masses, copied straight out of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book on the virtues of communistic fascism. One of the main goals of China is to erase America's proud history. This is reflective in Kemi the Kami's quote, "What can be, unburdened by what has been, bumper-stickered stupidity." Yes, Kemi the Kami's soul brother, Mao Zedong, wanted to erase history too, to make the peasantry forget that they ever had any freedoms. He had 4 goals for the total makeover for China during the Great Leap Backward. Number 1, seize land and businesses. Number 2, start a cultural revolution. Number 3, spur economic growth. And number 4, launch collectivization. That's loser speak for elevating the group above all the people in the group. By the way, Mao Zedong and Karl Marx both refused to bathe. They would bathe almost never. Coincidence or a sign of disorganized thinking? Anyway, getting back to point number 4, launching collectivization. This cannot be achieved without erasing the past. Censoring books and burning books is necessary, and Mao Zedong certainly did this. Liberals love to clutch their fake pearls and gasp while referring to the horrid censoring of all that awesome kiddie porn in school libraries. And liberals love real censorship. They couldn't exist without the Chinese-controlled media censoring all of the good sound, logical, truthful thinking completely out of public discourse with all their retarded political correctness. Then there's something called FISA, which are the procedures used when collecting information about those suspected of being foreign spies or being involved in terrorism. The law enforcer of FISA is the DHS. One of the main stated goals of the DHS is to, and I quote, rid America of weapons of mass destruction, unquote. Again, this is 100% Orwellian or gaslighting, or call it the opposite of what it is. That's what the DHS claims, though. First of all, who's the Einstein who can actually trust the DHS to find any WMDs? Anyone? Anyone? Who trusted the DHS when their deaf, dumb, and blind, ugly stepsister in air quotes law enforcement, the anti-secret service, couldn't find its own ass using both hands and a rearview mirror on a sunny day? AKA the Trump near-miss assassination. Who can trust these criminally negligent moron a-holes who ran these once trusted organizations into holes in the ground? No one. You may think I'm exaggerating, and surely things have changed now that Trump's in power. That still remains to be seen. But what did many years of wide-open American borders tell you? Did that reassure you that the DHS was even 10% on top of anything? Any pretending over how we need to make sure Americans are safe and secure means absolutely nothing to me. Why? Because of those erased borders. And many millions of illegal alien criminals are still here. Very few have left America. Any desperate government grab to take away your freedom does nothing for your safety. It only hurts it, obviously. Why can't we just cut through all the crap here and now? I'll make this as simple an equation as I possibly can. Loss of freedom, no matter how gradual, is one of the worst things you can lose, and it seldom returns without extreme bloodshed. Even then, it is often lost forever. And there's no excuse whatsoever that can allow this to ever happen. Tyranny usually starts up gradually. It sounds reasonable to anyone who is too busy to contemplate this, which is just about everybody. But guess what? As an American citizen, it is your job to take the time to contemplate and analyze this on your terms. We Americans are supposed to figure tyranny out so we can tear it apart. This new ID is part of the Real ID Modernization Act. The assumption behind that dishonest title is that if we don't start tracking U.S. citizens like hunters track deer, then we, as Americans, aren't fully modern. And why is it a real ID as opposed to a fake ID? Is someone over there at DHS a frustrated comedian trying to be funny? Here, let me show you my fake ID to go clubbing. I better show you my real ID instead. This is entirely Orwellian. The need for a real ID is totally fake. Think back. We used to identify or ID most people mostly by their faces and reputation in the community, at work and in church. That was real. Today it's, just show me your freaking card. Or better yet, let me scan you. Which is far more superficial or not real. A huge subcategory on the Real ID website pertains to Afghans, and I ain't talking about the hounds, I'm talking about the terrorists. Many years of open borders and liberal immigration policy has made the need for a new ID moot. Dangerous people do need to be tracked, but if the illegals were kept out of America in the first place, there would not be this concern. The deep state wants both open borders and the Real ID. But don't both policies contradict each other? Don't both cancel each other out? Of course. But they insist no. What does that tell you? They want America brought to her knees. And I don't mean by praying to Jesus. This from newsfortherightmind.blogspot.com. Those who do not like it, who choose not to be ear-tagged, will be rendered inert. Even traveling on foot or bicycle will become problematic, since without a real ID, one is vulnerable to being hassled by heroes, the state's costumed enforcers who may demand a formally free person to provide said ID upon demand merely to prove he's not a criminal. Does anyone out there notice the inversion or care anymore? Thus died freedom in this country to the accompaniment of flag snapping and hand clapping. For the record, the historical record, one day people will look back on this era and marvel that such a thing could have happened. Again, didn't they remember the past? Just 43 congressmen and 1 out of 99 senators voted against all this when the law was proposed back in 2005. One of those lonely stalwarts was Ron Paul, who tried, and he said this: supporters claim it is not a national ID because it is voluntary. However, any state that opts out will automatically make non-persons out of its citizens. The citizens of that state will be unable to have any dealings with the federal government because their ID will not be accepted. They will not be able to fly or take a train. In essence, in the eyes of the federal government, they will cease to exist. It is absurd to call this voluntary. His son, Rand Paul, took note and drew the appropriate conclusions. One does not become a leader in the United States by promising to defend the liberties of the people. One becomes a leader by demanding they be taken away. Unquote. What does all that remind you of? Becoming a non-person? I can hear the Jews screaming from the boxcars now. This notion of top-down fascist control is entirely Nazi-like in its application. The alleged purpose of the DHS was to prevent terrorism, but until recently, who headed up? That bald-headed, bandana-wearing butthead, Alejandro Mayorkas. So does anybody with a 3-digit IQ believe that stupid bilge? Alejandro turned the DHS into a terrorist organization. Look at the abuse of all those 100% innocent, legal American citizen election integrity patriots from January 6. Why do we need a real fake ID? It makes no sense. It was simply a 2 or 3 paragraph recommendation in the 9/11 report to Congress, and that was it. Just a recommendation. It also failed to draw any logical conclusion as to how a national ID card could have prevented 9/11 when the authorities knew about the expired visas of the 9/11 terrorists. The overemphasis on identification is being greatly overused, and it's greatly misunderstood, again, on purpose. The 9/11 terrorists didn't really try to hide who they were. They were pretty out in the open. All this danger was staring the watchdog authorities in the face, and they did nothing but ignore all the red flags. So the so-called need for a more expansive identification card is a non sequitur. It provably has nothing to do with keeping you safe. The United States has simply taken its cue from China. Our leaders who go to China get the very strong message that they can too become as special and revered and as powerful as the Chinese Communist fascists if they simply follow the model that the Chi-Coms created many decades ago. They've been spying on and controlling their own people like this for many years, and because the American electorate is so weak and distracted and simple-minded, Congress feels like they can easily get away with this obvious invasion of privacy too in order to control anti-government nonconformists. I can't help but think of those war movies about traveling inside Nazi Germany. They need to see your papers, please. Which made sense back then because anti-Nazi dissidents and foreign spies were everywhere. So it makes me think that Deep State America is girding its loins for a fantastic amount of coming blowback protests resulting from a greatly expanded totalitarian government someday. By the way, the Real ID Act is also the law that paved the way for President Trump's push for a border wall. It came first to counter and neuter his promise to preserve our national sovereignty. Real ID is a way of simply targeting those who view this whole real fake ID surveillance scam in a lackadaisical fashion. In other words, conservatives will automatically be exposed simply because they will not want to go along with this nonsense. Think about it. Anyone who wants the freedom of mobility must conform, but true freedom lovers will not conform because, in this case, the nonconformists will stick out like a sore thumb. People who love freedom will not want to be controlled. It's the perfect scam. This obsession with identification is all about tracking, not safety. This all closely mirrors the mark of the beast, meaning anyone who wishes to buy or sell must take on that mark. Real fake ID is obviously a precursor to that, but no one in the media speaks of it in these terms. Many conservative Christians will not take the mark, which could simply be the woke ideology and not necessarily a tattoo, although it could certainly be both. Real fake ID makes it easy where it's not so easy now to delineate so as to persecute those political opponents on a massive scale, and all under the very convenient argument that it is for Americans' safety. From SoCalPublicSquare.org, legislatures and governors should stop the DMV from issuing any more real IDs and gas legislation that bars retailers, landlords, and other institutions from requesting or requiring real ID. And our congressional representatives should attach a repeal of real ID to any and all must-pass legislation. This is a cause well worth shutting down the government over. Defiance isn't easy, but it's our best available strategy. In this case, it's also necessary because real ID is incompatible with life in a free society." Unquote. Next, let's take a closer look at FISA. FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Its express purpose is to spy on foreign nationals, but not American citizens. But there have been 278,000 abuses of this act, ignoring the Fourth Amendment's requirement for search warrants of Americans. They have been spied upon without probable cause, and some 10,000 government employees had access to this data. FISA was used to spy on the Trump campaign in 2016 to try and defeat him. FISA is now focusing on children's faces using AI. This is naturally a part of getting to them early so as not to let the smarter kids grow up and get wise to the dirty tricks of their corrupted government. The more independent ones need to really be face-tracked. FISA has nothing to do with safety except for the loss of your safety. It has everything to do with government control. China needs to tightly rein in and regulate their citizens too, because anti-government dissidents must be closely watched so as to limit damage to the Chi-Com status quo. America is China's protege in this regard. Ben Franklin said, "Those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." If America becomes China's mini-me, then America fails as the world's watchdog, and China can expand and move freely throughout the world. Today, believe it or not, China is still largely hiding in the closet. That's why they have funneled trillions of dollars into the clandestine deep state laundered through these social justice fake causes with the great help of the George and Alex Soros billionaire networked crime syndicate. Now, this is obvious to anyone who's paying any real attention, but if all you do is listen to the Chinese Communist Fascist Mafia-controlled media or to the afraid-to-lose-their-money stream pseudo-conservative, cowardly podcasters and talk show hosts, then you won't hear any of this. You won't hear any kind of real meaningful analysis on either of these two really stupid, dense ideas. Real ID and FISA only makes sense to the totalitarian control freaks who want to corral everyone in America into groups, and they especially want to corral freedom-loving, constitutional-respecting conservatives into gulags, and very, very soon. The deep state is forcing a Sophie's choice between either we accept FISA and all their tyrannical spying, or we have none of FISA because spying on foreigners is racist, they tell us, and therefore we must open our borders to prove that we are not racist, so as to allow massive terrorist operations within the United States to gain political control and to spy on none of them. Either way, the deep state wins and you and your family lose. That's the plan 100%. They want this to be an either-or choice for us because going fully in one direction or the other will lead to the same outcome. Not spying on foreign nationals means overt chronic terrorism will occur throughout all of the United States. Full acceptance of FISA, on the other hand, means that all Americans are fair game to be spied upon, especially those troublemaking conservatives, which ultimately means that the terrorist deep state within will win eventually. Never mind that Trump is in power. That's only for the next 3.5 years. FISA is for the long haul. So there's really no difference between ISIS or Hamas and FISA, as controlled by the deep state. It essentially all means the same thing. It's just a matter of degree. So why don't conservative pundits and podcasters talk about this in the way that I'm talking about it right now? It's because they don't want to be shadow banned and deplatformed by social media fascistic platforms like TikTok and X for being too honest. No one wants to be censored. I certainly don't, but I'm willing to run that risk on this podcast, No PC Allowed, because America, you are fully worth that risk. The millions of young men who died for America thought you were worth that risk as well. Let us always remember them as we celebrate this Memorial Day. Give us 5 stars. Be sure to rate, review, and share with everyone you know. You've been listening to No PC Allowed. I am Mac Iverson.